What makes a shonen protagonist the strongest? Magic?
No.
Muscle?
No!
Training?
Nobody gives a shit!
No! Whatever you say, the correct answer is actually a parent being dead. And thus begins the tale of Ichigo Kurosaki, with his wacky dad still missing the long-gone mother of the household. Yet, in their seemingly normal home, Ichigo could see spirits, and one day, he could even see a girl, a very tiny girl, who called herself a Shinigami. Well, that was the start of a crazy adventure, but everything about Ichigo's origins was shrouded in mystery, and eventually, Ichigo's progress seemed to be impossible without uncovering his roots. And by shonen lore, there's always something special about missing parents of the protagonist, where knowing that much dreaded truth makes them several times stronger.
You are technically correct.
Welcome back everyone, it's time to go balls deep into Ichigo's family. That sounded kinda odd. But where better to start than Ichigo's father, Isshin Kurosaki. From the start, it was already insane that Ichigo had a huge reserve of Ryotsu. It even surprised Rukia when she transferred her powers over to him. Well, this of course was due to his heritage. Come on, nothing is just ever coincidence. Ichigo had his own latent Shinigami powers, all thanks to his hyper father. Isshin was no ordinary man. Instead, he too was a Shinigami some 20 years before the current events. And I'm not talking about some average Joe, but as he declared in the Arrancar arc, he had Ryotsu equal to that of a captain. Talk about underplaying his own powers though, because Isshin actually was the captain of the 10th division of Gotei 13. Yep, before our chibi captain Hitsugaya took over, Rangiku had Isshin to pester with her habits. In fact, Hitsugaya was the 3rd seat in the 10th division and was promoted to captain later on. This was probably because Rangiku couldn't be the captain thanks to a dude with glasses in the past, stealing a huge part of her Ryotsu. Anyways, leaving that aside, Isshin was a great captain, that's for sure. But his ancestry is worth looking at as well, because he is also a descendant of the Shiba clan, which is one of the 4 noble Shinigami families. Yep, the same family that Kukaku and Kien belong to. Except that in Isshin's case, he was the head of the branch side of the family. So yes, that's why Kien looks eerily similar to Ichigo. Being from such a reputed family, you can probably guess that Isshin had an incredible high amount of Ryotsu and was extremely skillful. This was also reflected in how Ichigo's Ryotsu surprised the likes of Byakuya, because he himself was from a noble clan. However, Isshin was also devoted to his job as a Shinigami and would personally look into issues in the Soul Society often. And perhaps this empathy is what led Ichigo's life to transpire as it did to some extent, because during the time Isshin was a captain, Aizen had long since begun his awful experiments with the Hogyoku, turning civilians and Shinigamis into hollows. He had successfully eradicated Urahara and others from the Soul Society as well. Whilst Isshin did say that the Gotei 13 was already investigating the incidents, he took it upon himself to confront the criminal. This was sadly the start of some unfortunate circumstances. Isshin encountered a hollow in the human world, and he already denied the participation of any of his squad members, keeping their safety in mind. He also sent the deputy Shinigami in charge of protecting the Naruki townhome, but Isshin hadn't known that the danger would be too much for him to handle, because the hollow he came across was odd, both in appearance as well as Ryotsu. It was a black hollow, and Isshin noticed whilst fighting it that it felt as if he was fighting against a Shinigami. Not just that, the creature also fought like a menace rather than a mindless hollow. As the fight went on, Isshin entered Karakura town and warned a deputy Shinigami to get away, sensing that the hollow was about to shoot a Zero, and asked it who was pulling the strings in Soul Society. Well, Isshin's hunch was pretty damn accurate, because that was probably a Shinigami that turned into a hollow, which was unable to even speak or understand anything, because it was no longer a sentient being. Seeing such, Isshin whipped out his Zanpakuto and Getsu in order to finish the hollow off. However, he was struck from behind by someone, and well, you guessed it, it couldn't have been anyone other than Aizen himself, who had been watching the scenario play out all this while. Isshin dared the Shinigami who attacked him to reveal himself, but it it was no use. In fact, the wound Isshin had taken made him incapable of using his Bankai and forced him on the defensive in a lethal battle. Even then, Isshin somehow managed to sever an arm of the hollow, but was in vain because it continued attacking him and almost fired a Zero at point blank range that was sure to not only just take Isshin out but also kill him. But that's where our damsel in distress saved the prince. Wait a minute, that didn't sound right. Yeah, okay, fine, it's a reverse situation. This is where Masaki Kurosaki comes into play. And like Isshin, she was too not an ordinary woman. Of course, I get it and I will say it. Why does she resemble Orihime so much? Why, this is kind of sus. Anyways, coming back to Mommy Kurosaki, she was in fact the last and sole bearer of the Kurosaki name and had a huge burden to bear on her shoulders. Even though she was pretty young, she was one of the last few act or pure-blooded Quincy's. Since she had no family to house her, she was taken in by the Ishida family. But that wasn't just out of kindness. She was in fact meant to marry Ryuken, the father of Iryu. Yes, to maintain the pure blood of Quincy's. This weighed heavy on both Ryuken and Masaki's mind, even though they both suppressed it to uphold family traditions and customs. These customs were extremely strict in directing the behavior of the Quincy's, and one of them directed that pure-blooded Quincy's shouldn't spill blood easily. However, such restrictions weren't liked by Masaki, but she couldn't do anything about it because she doesn't want to be an ingrate. You know, she had to uphold the wishes of the ones who gave her shelter. Still, her primal instinct to save people overpowered her will to remain bounded by customs. Hence, she followed Isshin's and the Hollow's Ryotsu to the scene of the fight. Her betrothed man, Ryuken, strictly reminded her that she shouldn't get involved, but she did, and the timing was just right to save Isshin from dying. But she failed to hit the mark because of the Hollow's speed. She realized that the only way to kill this Hollow was to let it bite her, so then she could land a fatal attack at close range. Well, she certainly did defeat the Hollow, but it self-destructed, and Isshin took the impact of the blast. But don't worry, that wasn't enough to kill him, so the battle ended well. However, the consequences were far from over. Well, the first thing was that Masaki and Isshin, fell in love with each other at first sight. They kept thinking about each other and how despite their differences as a Shinigami and a Quincy, their assumptions and perceptions weren't quite accurate of the counterpart. But apart from that, there was some serious aftermath as well. Whilst everyone including Ryuken, Masaki and Isshin went about their lives like normal, Masaki's health kept regressing until one day she collapsed. She had a hollow hole in her chest and Ryuken rushed to find a cure. Eventually, Urahara and Isshin came to know about the situation and Urahara proposed a solution to quell the fight between the two men. After years of studying holification, Urahara broke the news that Masaki will never be the same as before. Whilst this process strengthens Shinigamis by crossing the boundaries between them and Hollows, this process is fatal for Quincy's and it attacks them at a very rapid rate. Luckily, Urahara knew of a cure, but it would be detrimental to her abilities as a Quincy. Yes, the solution was quite depressing because the only way to save Masaki was to introduce an opposing power into her to contain the holification. And of course, the only way to do that was for Isshin to give up his Shinigami powers that were opposite of the Quincy powers and transfer his soul into a Gigai. However, knowing that he was sacrificing his life as a Shinigami, Isshin didn't hesitate one bit and agreed to save Masaki. This in turn tethered his life to Masaki's until the Hollow eating Masaki's soul left or when she passes away. In Masaki's inner world, Isshin appeared to save her from the Hollow and killed it with his Getsuga Tensho. When she woke up, despite Isshin telling her that it was an accident and he just simply lost his powers, she sensed that it was a lie. In fact, she even realized her own powers were sealed inside of her body, making her unable to fight anymore. Either way, now saved, Masaki went on with her life. After graduating high school, Masaki moved out of the Ishida home because now she loves a new man. There's no point of her staying with Ryuken. It's kind of awkward at this point, right? So attending university, she would visit Isshin time and again as they started dating. Eventually, they would marry after Isshin graduated from college and opened a clinic. And so they lived happily ever after. No, this is a shonen manga, guys, we know what happens. She dies. Yes, sadly, due to the fact that Masaki having her powers taken from her, and again, Isshin is a human at this point, they couldn't fight back against the Hollow Grand Fisher. This tragically left Isshin to look after his motherless children all alone. Ichigo also experienced some trauma due to this event because, it's kind of his fault. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, so when Ichigo was born, he was a crossover of Shinigami, Hollow, and a Quincy. Isshin Shinigami's power were merged with the Hollow, which is why White Ichigo was actually Ichigo's Shinigami powers. On the other hand, Old Man Zangetsu becomes the manifestation of Masaki's Quincy powers. So the past of both Isshin and Masaki was extremely crucial in deciding the powers of Ichigo. In the 1,000-year Blood War arc, he had to come to terms with his origins and understand his powers to fully unlock the latent potential within. But this moves us on to Ichigo's sisters. Yes, we can't forget about them. We get introduced to Yuzu and Karin Kurosaki at the beginning of the story itself. These fraternal twins are both responsible caretakers of the Kurosaki house, even when their father goofs around. Despite being 4 years younger than Ichigo, Yuzu and Karin was also distraught about losing their mother Masaki. Even Karin, who used to be a crybaby, decided along with her sister that they should both mature before time in order to face the adversities together with the family. They both are truly as strong as their mother. But what about their powers? We all are thinking about that, right? Well, going back to how Isshin and Masaki's power were all gone, we know that Isshin lost all of his powers already, and Masaki's powers would also fade away with time. This explains why she lost her life against the Grand Fisher Hollow. So it was only by chance, or should I say hollow, that Ichigo received all the powers he did, but it wasn't the same for Yuzu and Karin. However, due to Isshin and Masaki's high spiritual power, Karin could at least see hollows, but Yuzu couldn't even see an outline of other spiritual beings, only blurry images like Chad did before his powers increased. This is why only Karin knew that Ichigo was a soul reaper, because she could actually see her brother literally run around with Shinigami clothes. She could see him clear as day. Along with that, Hitsugaya commented that Karin's spiritual pressure was higher than that of an average human, which is why she could see him. But even Karin's powers weren't powerful enough for combat, or barely anything that Ichigo was capable of. Ichigo getting his powers to become a Shinigami and the savior of the world was fate itself, because literally God was involved with him from day one. As we already know, Yahweh, however you like to pronounce him, was the father of all Quincy's, and his blood flows through every single one of them. And since Masaki was a Quincy, that too a pure-blooded one, a piece of Yahweh's soul was engraved into Ichigo's as well. It's revealed in the 1,000-year Blood War that Old Man Zangetsu, who Ichigo had been learning fighting from all this time, was actually Yahweh. Ichigo's entire life was directed by Yahweh's decision, even beyond Aizen's foresight. This is also why Ichigo's progress through the 1,000-year Blood War seemed exactly like Soul Society and the Arrancar arc, all until facing the final boss. It was all Ichigo's fate, but only his courage could break through the almighty all-seeing eyes. Yahweh might have guided Ichigo into the palms of his hands, but he hadn't planned to get defeated. Ichigo's courage had made Old Man Zangetsu's mind waver, and it had also cut down Yahweh's invisible powers. Despite being mixed Hollow, Quincy and Shinigami, more like that was the reason he could defeat Yahweh. So in a way, he was destined to stand up against Yahweh from the very beginning of Isshin and Masaki's first encounter.